So within the overall scheme of things, we have 5 different frameworks and 4 different acronyms. So we've done some of those. We're not going to do all of them today. The Canvian framework I'm not going to cover because you've already had that. There's lots of material on it. That's a decision support framework. It's important to understand that. It's not a complexity framework, it's a decision support framework, which uses complexity theory. Yeah? What I'm going to do now is what we would normally start an engagement with, which is a true complexity framework, which derives from quantum mechanics. All right? So I'm going to explain some of that to explain the context. So the principle on this, and it comes from this quote from Seneca, which is we can know the present, yeah, but we can't know the future. After I've done this, I'm going to go on to a famous quote from Napoleon, which says, we can't have foresight, but we can have forethought. Yeah, and that's a really significant quote. So we're going to do 3 frameworks today. The first is what's called the Estuarine framework. Remember I mentioned estuaries yesterday. The second will actually be looking at approaches to forethought. And then the final thing we'll do is the latest framework. You're the second audience to see this. The first was in Colorado last week, which is weaving risk and strategy together. Now we've done some of the build-up for that, but the idea is in a modern day and age, you don't do strategy and then assess the risk. Yet risk and strategy are interwoven, and you have to create a portfolio approach to change, which reduces your risk. So we'll talk about that. So that's the plan. Yeah? And on the side of that, I'll go through the whole idea of mass engagement in more detail because that's key. Remember I talked about this yesterday? And also last night, the whole concept of wisdom of crowds. You need lots of people from lots of different backgrounds interpreting data in real time without any consultation between the individuals, because then you can start to trust the results. Right, so that's the plan for today. As of yesterday, interrupt, challenge, ask questions. We're also going to talk a bit about the new approach we've been adopting to method and tool development. Remember I said in a complex system, you break things down and you recombine them. So we've been creating an approach to that by which we've taken all of our methods and tools and broken them down. But we've also opened up that environment to any other company, regardless of whether we agree with them or not, to use the same format. Yeah, so what that allows you to do is mix and match things from different method sets and different concepts to adapt to your local context and not adopt a single recipe from a single consultancy group. And we think that's a really important principle going forward. And it also supports the smaller consultancy groups rather than the big 4 or 5. And I always say kind of like the principle on here is you want many cultures, one set of methods, yeah, not the other way around. Yeah, so kind of like we'll build on that. So this is a British phrase which, given your horse racing background, you'll probably understand, which is horses for courses. Yeah, you need to know what course you're running on before you decide which horse to bet on. Right, so we're going to hold that principle. So this quote from Seneca, I think, makes the point. We spend a huge amount of time trying to predict the future, but we know that in a complex adaptive system, by default, we cannot predict the future. The only thing we know with absolute certainty is that whatever we do will produce unintended consequences. Now, a lot of us argued that from a theory base, like 20, 30 years ago, post-COVID, post-Trump, post some of the disasters which are happening in the Ukraine and Middle East, nobody actually challenges that anymore. The practical experience is regrettably catching up with the theory in terms of understanding. So that requires us, and I quoted this yesterday, I'll quote it again, famous quote from Lincoln's address, the American president to Congress, in the middle of the American Civil War, as the times are anew, so we must think anew, so we must act anew. And I quote that an awful lot because it's a brilliant idea. You don't only have to act differently, you have to think differently. And that matches Aristotle, Sophia and Pronesis, practical wisdom and theoretical wisdom. Neither will work without the other. You need both together. And again, a principle of our approach is to use natural science as a constraint because we know that won't change. Yeah, whereas cases change drastically. And I've laid out some of the natural science as I go. So this one comes from something in quantum mechanics. This is David Deutscher's work. If you don't know Deutscher, Deutscher was the guy who created the need for quantum computing. He was the guy who invented the whole concept. Really nice guy at Oxford University. And I attended a lecture by one of his PhD students at the Hay Festival. There's this annual festival in Wales called How the Light Gets In, which is nothing but 4 days of scientists and philosophers in debates and discussion. It's kind of like a pop festival for intellectuals. I've been going every year since it started in 2008. And it's a huge source of ideas because you hear ideas from people from radically different backgrounds encountering each other, and they sort of, something flicks and you think about that. So next year you do some more and then gradually develop the idea. So this comes from constructor theory in theoretical physics. So constructor theory is the first attempt in physics to explain things as a whole, not by finding the smallest possible particle. I often think we went far enough with quarks. I like quarks, they come in threes, all right? So the basic principle is quite simple. You first of all identify what they call the counterfactuals. Now, they're using that in a different phrase. Normally in English, that means an alternative history. So there's a huge amount of novels in England, all right, about what would have happened if Hitler had invaded England after. People get fascinated by alternative histories. The most important one, by the way, if you don't know it, is if Llywelyn, the last Prince of Wales, had supported Simon de Montfort at the Battle of Evesham, then Wales would still be an independent nation. But of course you all know that, so I don't need to go into details. These small turning points in history produce radical differences. So that's one meaning of counterfactual. And some of the narrative techniques we can talk about if you want later use counterfactuals to explore novel spaces. And actually also for command languages. So we can now, in 4 words, express a complex strategy by referencing common stories. And that's called metaphor-based command language. So there are various other things we can go into today, but that would come from that. In this context, counterfactual means counter the facts. So it's something which can't change. Right? So for example, gravity can't change. This is the example they normally use. Gravity is fixed. So having a business strategy which says we will levitate probably isn't going to have any major effect, all right? So that's the principle. Then you identify constructors. Now remember I mentioned constructors yesterday? Constructors are things which transform things but don't themselves change in the act of transformation. Constructors are really, really important for people to understand because creating constructors as part of your strategy creates points of certainty in terms of input-output. And that can be radical. So for example, in software development, a software object, that's a piece of code, has a defined input and always produces a defined output. It can be polymorphic, so it can represent itself differently, and it can inherit qualities from other objects. Now that means if you do a modern software design, you create a scaffolding, remember that from yesterday? A basic architectural structure. But then you allow objects to interact with each other and with the scaffolding. And novel properties will emerge as a result. If you look at social media, who could have predicted hashtags? What you do is you get the right level of granularity. Remember actants? You then change the interactions and you see what happens, and if it's beneficial, you reinforce it. So that's a principle we're going to carry on working with. Now, one of the things, just by the way, on software design, and this is really important in the age of AI, we're now actually arguing and creating methods by which we can create people-based objects which can interact with software objects. So if you look at a major software project, and I've been in the industry all my adult life, 20% of the user requirements cause 80% of the grief, because you can't actually define the requirement because the users don't fully know all the circumstances. Well, in modern software design, you put a people object in there rather than a software object. Remember I talked about crews yesterday? So it's a role combination. So in major software design, leaving some things to crews with a standard input and a standard output can handle much higher levels of ambiguity and get software products to market much faster. And then you see the stable patterns in how the human beings deal with information and you add further code at that point. Yeah? Let me give you another example of this because it's an important principle. You may or may not have heard of the UK government's patient record system. It was the biggest ever disaster in IT procurement by a government anywhere in the world worldwide. And that's a pretty high bar to achieve, all right, to be the biggest ever government IT procurement disaster. And IBM bid for it, and I was on the IBM bid team. And I remember myself, Sharon and Fiona, which was my team, we went in and we said, look, we looked at this. We should no bid. We should put in a non-compliant bid and tell them they got the specification wrong. Then if it goes disastrously wrong, they'll come back to us. Either way, IBM didn't like that, so we were thrown off the bid team. Yeah? And then IBM was really grateful they didn't win it because it was a total disaster, because it was a classic IT design. Yeah, hyper-rational, based on the assumption that everybody is as autistic as the average IT programmer and will do things in rational, logical ways. So they said, up front, we'll have a centralized database for all patient records. And it will be secure. Now, anybody who's in the IT industry knows you can't have a centralized database which is secure. Now, the rules in war games, if you don't know it, is if you pay enough money to the Russian hackers, you can break any database, no matter how secure, in an hour. So if you want real security, you don't have a centralized database. Yeah, you can prevent casual fraud, but you can't prevent determined hacking. Yeah? There's things we can do an attitude measure there which help. Attitudes to cybersecurity are more important than compliance measures. I'll talk a bit about that later. Yeah? So either way, so that's the idea. And then all doctors will have the same equipment. That's really going to go down well. All right? Doctors are not known for their willingness to conform based on what they've already done. Yeah? And the idea is everybody's records will be digitized and put on the central database, and then life will be wonderful because wherever you go in the health service, they've always got your records available to you. Everybody get the principle? And I remember looking at the guy they had directing it. He was a former CEO of ICL, who was famous for saying that human beings are a limited capacity information processing device who will be replaced by human beings. So they got exactly the wrong person running this. And of course, it went disastrously wrong. Yeah? The first thing is that in order to secure the database, they gave people credit cards to put in and out of the computer terminals accessing the data. Yeah, very sensible. Obviously, the person who designed it never had worked in accident and emergency. Do you think everybody in an A&E department can keep putting credit cards in and out of a computer to access patient records? So the most senior consultant at the start of the shift put his card in and left it there. And it was always a he in those days, all right? Of course, then the receptionist got to know that the database was open, so they hacked the database and sold a pop star's record to the newspapers. I could go on, all right? Basically, it was so structured that it was easy to break. And then the doctor said they wouldn't accept one type of kit, so the government insisted that they had to apply any kit. Well, that just adds complication. It just went out of control and spun and spun and spun. Yeah? So I say it was a major disaster. Part of the problem we got, by the way, though, is people keep saying, well, we could have got it right. Remember I mentioned retrospective coherence? Yeah, that's the danger, right? You look backwards and you say we could have got it right. You don't realize it's inherently wrong. We actually then put in an alternative bid, which got picked up in Australia and elsewhere. We said you do something much simpler. Remember I talked about actants and interactions? Didn't know the theory then, by the way. This is just using common sense. I now know the theory, and it's quite, go back to my work in the 80s and 90s, and realize that by just using a multidisciplinary common sense approach, that is really what complexity theory is about. We sometimes call it the science of common sense. Remember I used children's stories a lot to illustrate that. So he said it's much more simple. You define the actants. So I've got general practitioners, I've got hospitals, I've got ambulance drivers. I know who my healthcare providers are. Yeah? So what I do, and I also know that the patient is the only person who the record is relevant to. I may want to use some stuff for research purposes, but primarily it's located with the patient. So he said, right, the patient carries their records with them. Yeah, if they're actually within 2 or 3 years of dying, there's no point in digitizing their records anyway, and their paper form can just be kept by their bed. Yeah, so why are you digitizing that stuff? It's just a waste of money. And then we said the other thing is everybody can carry their records around on a credit card, or they can have an implanted chip in their wrist. And everybody said nobody would accept that. So I decided, well, I thought they might. So we ran I know Ogilvy and Mather quite well, all right? So we ran a little campaign. And we ran a campaign which said, you chip your dog and cat, why wouldn't you chip yourself? Yeah, which was actually quite clever. It worked, all right, because people realized that if you've got an autoimmune disease, you want the ambulance driver to know that without you having to tell them when you're comatose at the size of a motorway. So if you've got a little tattoo here and they can scan it, your life is going to be better. And then we said you invest in scanners. So every time a patient record interacts with a point in the medical system, they scan and write. And that's all you have to do. That's about 20 million, maybe. Yeah, not multiple million. And then you can implement it gradually, so you can start with the ambulance service, move on to GPs. Yeah, you can see what works and doesn't work. As things start to stabilize, you further automate them. But you don't automate them till you know what you're doing. You start to get the principle of a complexity-based design. Yeah, you change the actants, you change the interactants, you get a degree of automation, stabilization. You see what works. You've effectively kept your options open. Yeah? But people still, the trouble is, they still like massive IT procurements with massive promises about wonderful futures. And the reality is that's not the way to do it. It's not the way to design any human system, IT or otherwise. Come back to yesterday, 2 seconds. Change the actants, change the interactions, monitor the results, create some stability with scaffolding, and respond to what works, not what you think will work. Yeah?
What I understood right now, the concept of constraint came under the concept of actants.
Yeah.
And you did like differentiation between constraints and
constructors. Yeah.
So what I understood is the meaning of constructors that has a little bit, we can call it like positive meaning. Constraints like
please come on a phone call in with Alicia. No, please come on a phone call and Alicia Giuraro and explain that, all right? Because she and I are having major rows about this.
Okay.
Yeah, so she thinks constructors are just types of constraints.
Okay.
But Alicia thinks everything is a constraint. It's constraints all the way down. And I keep saying, when you talk to managers about constraints, they assume they're negative. Yeah, they think about Goldratt and theory of constraints. That's where they come from. So we can't use constraints positively. It's just too difficult to explain. Added to which, a constructor is not really a constraint. You know, I can use tortuous philosophy to make it one, but the reality is something which transforms something without changing is different from something which contains or connects something. Yeah, so yes, so we have modified that from the EU field guide. So constraint mapping is now morphed into Estuarine mapping, which I'm going to come on to. Yeah? But I just want to make this point on design, because complexity-based design is about reducing risk and reducing costs and increasing effectiveness. The minute you do a whole system design without ambiguity, you're assuming the system is ordered. And anything to do with citizens, whether it's health or education or anything else, is highly context-specific. It's not context-independent, and it's actually highly likely to trigger emergent properties which will be negative, not positive. So you need to architect the system to handle that. So it's actants, interactions, monitors, scaffolding. Remember, that's where we more or less started yesterday. Okay? So what they do, coming back to constructor theory, it says you identify the counterfactuals, the things which won't change. You identify the constructors, and then whatever has the lowest energy cost will win. Now, this is 101 physics. Everything tends to the lowest energy gradient. They wrote a brilliant account of evolutionary theory using this. So instead of survival of the fittest, they talked about survival of the most energy efficient. So one of the reasons, and I mentioned this yesterday, for the development of cooperative behavior in humans, remember I talked about macrodemes in winter coming together for survival, is that actually it reduces energy consumption. And that's why it evolves. Now that gives us a predictive mechanism, because if I can measure the energy gradients of the present, I've got a better predictive tool than scenario planning. Yeah? Yeah, sure.
sitting here wondering if you are really reaching the audience. I could be totally wrong, could be totally crazy. New topic, very heavy. A little bit of accent, that's English. So I'm wondering if, as you very nicely explain these important concepts, if there is a way that we can have an idea about your reaching the audience sitting here.
Well, I can try, and I can ask them to ask me questions. And I can use a format which has worked with other audiences, is what I'm doing, and I'm building to a picture. But the only thing I can handle is if people ask me questions if they don't understand something.
If we can then design this within the activity. I'm wondering, I could be wrong.
No, we're coming on to an activity. Yeah, we're going to give people an exercise in about 20 minutes. But I'm open. If anybody wants to say they don't understand something, I'll try and find other words. If people want to ask a question for clarification, yeah. I will repeat what I said last night, is one of the things I've been impressed about audiences in the Middle East and Latin America is they are prepared to suspend understanding while they get to understand it. They don't require to understand everything up front, yeah. And this is a different way of thinking, but interrupt, ask questions. Yeah? Anybody want to do that? Sorry?
Don't worry, we will. If we don't
Okay, cool. I don't want you to feel nervous about that. Right? Okay, so let me complete this and say we are going to give you an exercise to make this real. I will also say this has taken off much faster than Canvian did. Canvian is more difficult conceptually than Estuarine mapping. Yeah, I'm giving you the background to it. So coming back to this, all right? So what we want to do is to identify what the energy gradients are in the present. Yeah, so what will take more energy, what will take less energy, what will take more time, what will take less time. So there's a basic principle here. If to change something would take a lot of energy and a lot of time, then it's a counterfactual. In any project, we've got to assume that that can't change. And I will say that we've actually done this and mapped it against people doing workshops to decide where they would like to be. And where they would like to be often ends up as a counterfactual because it's idealistic, it's not realistic. Yeah? So the process is quite simple. First of all, we identify all the actants in the space. I can't draw this, so I'm going to have to show you a complete picture, so sorry about that. That's the high pencil problem. Yeah? So basically, identify all the actants. Remember, actants from yesterday are actors, yeah, or constraints, or constructors, and we spent a lot of time on that yesterday. So people brainstorm, and we put that up as a triangle so people don't see it as a set of categories. Okay? And people brainstorm anything which is having any influence in the system. Yeah? And then they basically position it on the triangle. And then the rule is, and again I mentioned this yesterday, if you don't agree what it is, break it down until you agree. We don't want any argument. This is designed to produce an objective assessment. Yeah? And by the way, breaking it down often means adding context statements. In this context, it would be this. In that context, it would be this. Yeah? Having done all of that, we then map it onto a grid in which the vertical dimension, and I'll show you that in a second, is the energy cost of change, and the horizontal dimension is the time it would take to change things. And guess what? If you can't agree where it's placed, you break it down until you agree. Now, one of the reasons we're doing this is to produce an absolutely objective, non-controversial assessment of the current situation, not influenced by argument or power. Because if you have to debate something and agree what it is, the most powerful person will win. If you're not allowed to debate and you break it down until you agree, it allows all voices to be heard equally. And that's really important in situational assessment. we're also separating assessment of the situation from deciding what you will do. Because if you have a workshop which is designed to produce an outcome, everybody will assess the situation in order to support their desired outcome. Yeah, you can't not do that as a human being. You assess the evidence to support what you want people to do. Yeah? So we're trying to break that dependency as well. They've got the basic principle, and then we identify 3 spaces. So the map, yeah, the process looks like this. Sorry, it's not like that. So what I'm going to do is identify all phenomena in the space, all the things which I can identify working. I map them as constraints, constructors, or actors. Yeah, break them down till I agree. And I place them on this grid, so I've got the energy cost of change, and there's a negative cost as well. So those are things where it will take energy to stop them changing. They're continuously changing anyway. And the time. And then I get, by consensus, a line. That's the black line. So it says everything top right of that realistically will not change. And guess what? If you can't agree where the line is, you break things down until you agree. It's really, really simple instruction. Yeah? And by the way, we always do this on horizontal tables, yeah, not on vertical tables, and we take all pens away from all actors because we don't want anybody drawing a line. So we literally use coloured threads and fishing weights so that people can move the thing around until they agree. And so I'm getting really pragmatic now, but that matters, right? So, and then when we did this with Novartis on clinical trials, one of the things that they came back and they said, look, there's a whole bunch of stuff which we know could change, but we can't change it. So where do we put it? So we created a liminal zone for that. So these are things where people in the workshop, they can't change them, or people they can directly influence can't change them, but somebody else might. Now this was fascinating because I pulled in one of the top 10 in Novartis to look at the map. He took one look at the stuff in that space and he said, of course you can change it, you've never asked. And that is very, very common. Yeah, we're making things visible to people in a way that they can respond to. Now note, and I can't overemphasize this, at no stage are we saying we necessarily want to change these things. We're saying if we did want to change them, what would be the energy cost of change or the time to change? Yeah, that actually again increases neutrality. Yeah, it's assessing the situation. And then the final line, the bottom one, that's kind of like the volatile zone. So that's actually a dangerous area. Things there can change almost instantly without intentionality. And so we also overlay onto that map, people highlight the ones they think which would have high impact. So if you've got a high impact actant in that space, it's dangerous. Now, everybody got that. We're going to let you do this in a minute, probably for Saudi Arabian health system if you want, but you can choose your own subject. Right? So everybody got that. Okay. Now what we then do is we actually undergo a series of separate actions. I'm going to keep this simple for the moment, but I'll give you a list of more actions. We've got over 15 action types now. But the most simple action is to move things around on the board. So you might want to make something impossible to change. Remember I talked about actants becoming scaffolding? That's that move. You can say, actually, we really don't want this to change, so how do we make the energy cost really high? You might say for this one, well, if we decided to change it, we'd like to do it faster, but we can cope with the energy cost, or vice versa. And energy, by the way, is a proxy for money or resource or attention or anything. Yeah? So that's the principle. And at the moment, we're just dealing with linear time. That will change next year. Because for human beings, time changes based on activity and familiarity. You all know that. If you walk to somewhere, well, you don't walk to many places in Saudi Arabia in summer, but if you walk somewhere, it takes longer than when you walk back. Because when you walk back, you know the path. Therefore, it's taking far less subjective time and attention from you. So we are going to bring those sort of modifications in next year. Now this is a very simple tool. To do this takes 2 half days. Yeah, our recommendation, we can now do this with software, with SenseMaker, but we recommend you don't do that first. You run 2 half-day workshops, an afternoon and a morning. And that's responding to what you said, sir. Some of this is new for people, so they need time to absorb it. Yeah? So what we do is the first day, we produce the map. The second day, we produce the actions. And that's a really useful split. And what you're actually doing, if you think about it, if you do this before you run a big project, you're de-risking the project. Yeah? Because what the actions will also do is to change the environment so that the project is more likely to succeed. So you don't just jump into the project. Remember I used the word substrate yesterday? You change the substrate so your project is more likely to succeed. Yeah? Into what, sorry? Yeah, you could actually, because you might want to do that in the exercise I'll give you now and see. But yes. Yeah. One of the things which surprised us on this, but we're now building capability on, is executives having gone through the workshop, then went away and did the map for themselves. And we're introducing that as a whole new approach to coaching. So you don't talk about your inner self and your psychological reaction, which is more psychology. Yeah? You talk about what are the actants in your environment. Yeah? What are the energy costs of change, what you don't want to change, and you manage the environment in which you're working rather than trying to manage yourself. And that, by the way, matches far more now with what we know from cognitive neuroscience, that we're more defined by how we interact with people than by any innate qualities of the person. So that's starting to move coaching into something which is more realistic in scientific terms. Okay, any questions on that? Because if, yeah.
You have an example for the energy when it comes like minus energy. I didn't get it yet.
Okay, well, I have to confess this, all right? The model originally didn't have the bottom bit. Then one day, my arm slipped and I drew the bottom bit by accident. So I decided to leave it there and see what happened. And people found it quite useful. So what it means is things which are continuously changing anyway, so you actually have to do something to stop them changing. Yeah. So, and I'm not going to give you an example. By the way, this is a key facilitation technique. If you give people an example, they'll copy it. Facilitators have too much power. When we did a lot of our original design on methods, we did it in Denmark when I was in IBM, because Denmark didn't like IBM. They were Scandinavian, so they liked rebellious stuff, right? But it meant we could facilitate in English, but the participants would speak in Danish. And that meant the facilitator couldn't intervene in the content. And we think that's really important. At one point, we created a thing called the 3 facilitator rule, which you might want to use because it's a fun way of playing the game. You don't have 1 facilitator, you have 3. 1 facilitator leads the group, the other one sits at the back of the room and monitors the first, and the third one is out of the room doing their email. The minute the second facilitator thinks the first facilitator is influencing the group in any way whatsoever, and you'd be amazed if you just smile at somebody who says something you like, they'll say more of it. They stand up at the back of the room, at which point the first facilitator hands over to the second and says, I will now hand you over to my colleague. They leave the room and the third one comes in to monitor the second. The world record for that is 28 minutes before somebody got taken out. And that was Sharon after years of practice. Yeah? You influence groups. If you're sitting where I'm sitting, your influence is too powerful if you get engaged in the content. Your job is to facilitate the process, not the content. Okay? Right. So what I'd like you to do, and one other thing to add to this, you notice that thing at the top there. If you have something which is occurring which you can't attribute to an actant, you make a separate note of it. It's called an unexplained phenomenon. That's the equivalent of dark matter in physics. You can see an effect, but you can't see what is creating the effect. And that's another measure of risk. That becomes a separate process. Okay? Now, we can't do 2 half days in half an hour. So the idea on here is to get you to play with the concept, yeah, very quickly. And again, like yesterday, form into groups which seem natural to you. Pick your subject. If you can't think of a subject, the two which we use a lot are public health and public transport, because they're kind of like universals. Everybody has that as a context, right? So feel free to choose those if you haven't got one you want to deal with. Yeah? And what I want you to do is to start off, just have a very quick brainstorm, maybe 15 minutes. We'd normally allow an hour for it. What are the actants? And just experiment with breaking some of them down till you agree. Then another 15 minutes, map those actants onto the grid, and again break them down till you agree. And then another 5 minutes, draw the lines. Everybody got that principle? So I'm going to give you 35 minutes for this exercise. Okay, now hopefully you found that relatively easy. We found this has gone, we put it into the public domain 2 years ago, and it's kind of like grown like wildfire without the need for us to be involved much, which is good news. We kind of like recommend you're mentored the first 2 times, and we've got a couple of online courses that will take people through it slowly, which we're going to have conversations about converting into Arabic and having them run locally, right? And that's our sort of framework. But this is a really simple 2 half-day, do it before you do something big. It's a very good way of getting people to engage in something in the early stages. You don't want to explain the whole of complexity theory, distributed cognition, and all the stuff I've been teaching you to a senior purchaser who's got other things on their mind. But if you say, look, we've got a simple 2 half-day process, at the end of it, we'll know what realistically we can change, what the cost of change is. We'll know how to change the space so our project is more likely to succeed. You've got a really pragmatic proposition, and it's 2 half days. Yeah, that's a very small risk, yeah, if it produces a result. And as I say, we can now automate this in SenseMaker, so we can capture the data from a large population, and we can populate the grid based on the way they index their identification. And that's even more objective. You would then refine it, yeah, but if you can actually use the whole of a workforce, for example, let's take the medical profession, the thing I was talking about in California. What we're going to start doing as we build those networks of primary health care, social workers, etc., is we can then ping them and say, for the next week, every time you encounter an actant, we use it, wouldn't you, record it. Right? So we can start to build a dynamic estuarine map, not a static estuarine map. Right? Now, the reason we use the metaphor in estuary is important, and I realize it's difficult. This is really difficult in Central Europe because they don't even have a sea coast, all right? But as I say, in Wales, we have several different names for estuaries because we have lots of different types. But I got the idea, so I was on a conference call with people who were talking about process philosophy and flow. And there is a danger on this, particularly in North American, Northern European thinking, of assuming everything is always flowing in one direction. Right? And it's why they like things like process philosophy. And I said, it's not a river, it's an estuary. The water can flow backwards. Right? And that's a really important principle, because in an estuary, the water flows one way, then it flows the other way. There's things you can do at what's called the turn of the tide, when the tide is moving, that you can't do when the tide is running. Which brings in, by the way, a Greek concept of kairos, the right time. Knowing when the right time in is really important. Yeah? Yeah, there are there are granite cliffs that maybe you have to check every 10 years. There are sandbanks which are changing every day. The level of salt in the water indicates the health of the estuary. Yeah? You have to make choices between, do you employ local guides to get shipping through the estuary, or do you dredge a channel and buoy it so you don't need the guides? Yeah, so the metaphor is really powerful because it introduces this concept of there isn't one right solution, there are multiple choices based on context. Yeah? So Estuarine mapping is our recommended first stage into understanding complexity. It is a genuine complexity framework, but it doesn't require you to understand the science to understand the application, which is why it took about 6 or 7 years for us to move it into the public domain. It takes a lot of time to get things to that level. Yeah? But there's a really solid body of theory behind it. Singapore government are now using it as a scenario planning alternative, which is something I'm going to come on to next. Because if I can basically say these things can change and these things can't change, even if I use it as a pre-process for conventional scenario planning, I'm in a powerful stage. So what I can do is to say, okay, yeah, I've got my counterfactual line. Give me scenarios about how that could change its position and get in better focus. Not the whole situation, but if that counterfactual line changed, everything would change. In real time, you need to monitor that line very carefully because you're assuming it can't change, so if you get weak signals, you need to pay more attention. If you've got low impact things, you're not fussed about them. High impact things, you're more concerned. So we go to the high impact areas and we say if the energy gradient on this suddenly shifted, what would be likely to happen? You see where I'm going with scenario planning? I'm breaking it down to more highly focused things based on an overall map. Okay, any questions on that? Because if not, I'm going to move on to foresight, yeah?
I have one simple question because I like the phrase you said, there is no single right answer,
Yeah.
but multiple choices based on context. It's true statement, but my fear revolves around how people look for certainty, for a single answer. So we are not managing the situation here, we are managing people.
Yeah, you're talking about the big 5 consultancy model. People want a one right answer where they can blame McKinsey's if it didn't work, right? Yeah, nobody used to get fired for buying IBM, and now nobody gets fired for implementing a McKinsey's report. I mean, I think I said this, but when I was a strategy director, I commissioned McKinsey's twice. I told them what I wanted to hear, they wrote it up, and then I was at no risk from implementing it. So yeah, it's a problem, right? I think you need to go to something that people will understand. So there's 2 things you can get senior people to understand. One is the concept of a portfolio. And I'm going to come on to that. You know, strategy should be a portfolio. It shouldn't be a single strategy. Nobody will put all their investments into one company. Well, having said that, I've done that, but it's my own company, but that's my own foolishness, all right? The reality is everybody understands the concept of a portfolio. Everybody understands the concept of keeping their options open for as long as possible. And everybody, to add a third, understands horses for courses. Yeah, the context may change everything. So you start from things that people are familiar with, and then you apply them to the novel approach. Yeah, so you can see one of the things that we're doing with Estuarine Map is we're working out what the race conditions are before we bet on a horse. I'm giving you one metaphor, you might develop others. Metaphors are really powerful. They're one of the ways human beings think abductively. Remember I talked about abductive, inductive yesterday? Metaphor is an abductive technique because it triggers a different way of thinking in people because you're associating the unfamiliar with the familiar. Right? You can say, well, we're about to do strategy. Shouldn't we have a portfolio of options to reduce our risk? And that's where we come on to RAS later, which is portfolio based. So, you know, don't go in, never go in with, we got a wonderful new way of doing everything. McKinsey's can do that because they've got people attuned to a cycle of every 3 or 4 years, throwing out everything they recommended 4 years ago and replacing it with something new. You won't be able to do that, yeah? And actually it's a bad thing to do anyway. Most of the things we did 3 years ago are still valid, we just took them too far. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with business process re-engineering in manufacturing. There's everything wrong with it in services. Because services are complex, manufacturing is ordered. Yeah? There are some things that I wouldn't go with, like blue and red ocean strategy, because they tend towards a single solution. Yeah, but most, if you look at it, there's nothing wrong with a lot of systems thinking, provided the constraints permit limited causality. But when you don't have causality, systems thinking breaks down completely. And that's the key point I've been trying to make, is everything works within boundaries. The issue is to know where the boundaries are and then to develop new things on the other side of the boundary. And that's also a key sales tactic. You basically say, look, what we did was great, but where didn't it work? Okay, it didn't work, maybe because it would never work there, maybe we see something new. Remember I said this yesterday, focus on the intractable problems. Focus on the problems which have been around for a long time that conventional solutions have failed on, because it's probably because the problem was complex and people treated it as if it was ordered. So patient journey is a good example. Patient journey is a massive issue. Right? You know, if patients have more autonomy in their healthcare regime, you thankfully congratulated me on losing weight. The best diagnosis I ever got in my life was type 2 diabetes, because it triggered a change. I reversed it. You know, if you don't know, you can reverse diabetes by starvation. That's how you reverse it, because it re-triggers the pancreas if you get it early enough. If you combine starvation with exercise, then you get a permanent reversal, which I can confidently say I have, because they've taken me off the register, so that's good news, right? But my point is how you get patients to change their behavior and take agency in their life, which if you want to read my daughter's thesis, it's the anthropology of male diabetes, because she found what I was going through fascinating, so she got the university prize for the best thesis on it, so I'm quite proud of that. She then wanted to work on mental health, so I was talking with her professor about how we got her to do a PhD, and she said she's waiting for you to be a subject again, and I'm still recovering from that one, all right? Either way, right, so to come back to the point, that's an intractable problem. There isn't a single cause of type 2, and there isn't a single solution. Yeah, particularly if you're going to change an habitual change, and we'll come back to habit. I'm going to talk about habits next, all right? Habits are really important because they reduce energy consumption. And remember, the human brain only uses about 20 watts of energy. Compare that with AI, right? And that's really important to remember, right? So find the intractable problem and don't offer to solve it, offer to find a way to find a better solution. Right? So Estuarine mapping does that because it says the first stage we need to do is to identify what the environment or the substrate we're in is like, what changes it will support and what changes it won't support, and then we need to change the environment so that the things we want to do are easier. Another intractable problem which we talked about yesterday is how do you involve youth in the future of the country? Remember that? Okay, it came up last night and not everybody was here, so I want to repeat the response to that. You can't do it by having youth assemblies. That doesn't work. Right? When I was 18, yeah, I was the lead debater in the school. We won the school debating competition for the UK, so we were proud of that, all right? And we went to debate with the Americans, which was an interesting experience because their debating is legal and ours was about destroying the opposition. So we had a lot of fun, but you know, it's another matter. But so I got elected to the Youth Parliament for Wales. All right, so we all went down to Swansea University and we spent 3 days solving the problems of life, the universe and everything because we were young and ideal. And then guess what happened? Nobody did anything with what we said. Right? And you see that pattern around the world at the moment. So kind of like I've gone through 2 approaches over the last 2 days, so let me refresh you. One is transgenerational coupling. You put young people with people from their grandparents' generation with somebody who actually has the power to make a difference and have lots of those trios working on problems within an area like Riyadh. So I'm using young and naive and idealistic with old, networked and cynical with somebody with power. Yeah, that way I'm entangling the views of the youth with the needs of the country. I'm not keeping them separate, which puts them in a box that you can ignore. The other thing is our Children of the World project, which we're about to start in Hong Kong at a nation-state level, which we've run in Sweden, we've run in Colombia, which is available for any other city or country to adopt, which is you actually create a school curriculum. All school curriculums, by the way, have a section for citizen engagement, statistics, analysis, reporting. The International Baccalaureate, do you have that here? Okay, so Olli Pekka, who's the director of that, is an old friend of mine from when he was a minister in Finland. He's also behind this initiative. Yeah? So what you do is you make your 16-year-olds citizen journalists as a school project. And they go into the community every week and they interview people. They act as ethnographers. They gather data. You then look at the patterns of that data and you respond. A mayor can look at the patterns of youth input over the whole of their city and see what patterns are emerging to which an initiative would get natural resonance. So you don't do an initiative and try and persuade people to support it. You find where people are starting to think in a different way and you put an initiative in which will amplify that. Yeah, that's a very different approach. And this is the work we did with the US government on counterterrorism, because we said states can use their citizens as sensors. So states can actually behave asymmetrically. They don't have to be a symmetric power, they can be an asymmetric power. And you can also say these stories gathered by children in school X gave rise to this public transport initiative, so you further the engagement. Now, you see the principle here? Remember I'm changing the granularity, I'm changing the actants, I'm changing the interactions, I'm monitoring what happens, and if something good happens, I'm amplifying it very quickly. Yeah? And I'll make this other comment. Children get data that researchers can never access. Yeah? I mean, nobody refuses a kid on a school project. There were experiments running this in Chicago, by the way. They had a competition between market research agencies and a school in one of the projects, which are slums in Chicago, as to who could get access to 5 named CEOs the fastest. The school won hands down. The market researchers were all ignored. Right? And so this is kind of like using natural contours in a landscape. The other ones we've used are sports clubs. All sports clubs have a need to know why their kids are playing sport, why some people don't. Parental support is key. Yeah, soccer's coming up in this region, it's a major issue. You do not want soccer mums and dads on the side of a pitch abusing a referee. We've actually had assaults on referees in the UK now by parents, right, which is like crazy. So coaches want kids to capture stories. Well, that's good news. We did it in South Wales. If you don't know it, one of the big growth areas in South Wales at the moment is young girls playing rugby. Yeah, it's a massive growth area. Wales, if you don't know it, is matriarchal. Oh, it's very strictly matriarchal, so you're mildly worried about what your wife thinks. If your mam tells you to do something, you do it without hesitation. It's called the Welsh mam. I have 2 Welsh employees who put the Welsh mam voice on me from time to time, and I obey it before I'm realising, even though they're both young enough to be my daughters. All right? If your grandmother is angry with you, you prostrate and beg for forgiveness. If your great-grandmother is angry with you, you leave the country and wait for permission to re-enter, right? So the basic practice in Wales, which still applies, is men hand over their wages packet to their wife on a Friday at the pithead. The wives give them their beer money back, and then the wives manage the community. And that's a practice which has emerged over several hundred years. So the main change agents in the Welsh valleys are women, not men. Yeah? And the young girls are playing rugby because they're poor. I mean, there are whole streets in the valleys in South Wales where nobody has seen employment for 3 generations. Yeah, so this is a welfare culture. You can imagine what that means. And so they've used rugby as a way of being beautiful rather than paying for it in beauty parlours in Cardiff. In fact, they're quite rude about girls from Cardiff. And what was interesting is fitness became an issue, but then they went into old people's homes and used the fitness exercises to make old people fitter, because they were concerned about their health. Yeah, rather like you were concerned about me. They said, we've got to be concerned about this. They actually gathered more stories to understand culture about social change than anybody else could have, because they were integrated into that system. Now, you have got a different culture over here from the one in South Wales, but that's my point about context specificity. Religious groups are also important. Yeah? We work with Jewish groups, for example, about the Shabbat meal. One of my best network people is a Muslim in America who did the first youth initiative to bring Muslims and Jews together across America. A brilliant young woman, right? Now at one of the colleges studying peace and reconciliation. Young people can achieve things older people can't, and they can move across barriers that older people can't. So actually looking at the future of faith in society is a hugely valuable project, but that also gives you another access to young people's voices about the nature of society, because faith is entwined with social systems. It's not separate from it in that sense. You get the sort of picture? Yeah. Now I'm trying to say this because those are intractable problems. Offering novel solutions at low risk is the way you get people into complexity theory. Okay, any more questions on that? I think I've now said everything that I said last night, which I didn't say yesterday, which means you're all up to date on it, so that's kind of like good news. Okay, so I now want to move on to an acronym. This is actually one of the oldest ones, and I've now got an Apple Pencil, so I'm feeling much happier, right? So thank you very much for bringing it in, right? This is one of the oldest things we ever produced within the company. And remember I said yesterday when I went through the European Union Field Guide, one of the most important things to do is to map what you know at the right level of granularity, yeah, so that you can repurpose it very quickly in a crisis. Everybody remember that? Yeah. Just checking, am I meant to give people a coffee break or not?
Yeah, we're going to have it.
Yeah.
Like 10 minutes.
Sorry?
10 minutes.
10 minutes time.
You can complete the point then.
Okay, cool. I'm just double checking.
Yeah.
Right? So one of the things that we first got started with was knowledge mapping. So mapping what people know. And now we understand complexity. We want to map it at a low level of granularity, because then we can repurpose it very quickly. Remember the example I gave of Philips lighting yesterday? Yeah, repurposing technology for urine-saturated staircases in a football stadium for a new garden product. Yeah, and that's the sort of radical thing you're looking for. So the problem is when people map knowledge, they would ask people what they knew, which is a meaningless question in a meaningless context. You only know what you know when you need to know it. Yeah? Context stimulates memory in humans. You don't know things in abstract. A computer will list everything it knows. A human being can't. No? We actually are much more efficient in our memory use than computers, because also we don't remember things perfectly, so we can adapt them faster. So what we said is, what we need to do is we need to gather all the decisions that people make. So just hold that for a moment, because decisions are where people use knowledge. Yeah? And then when people make a decision, we want to ask a simple question, and I'll run through this and then leave you to think about it while we have a break. And the question basically uses this form. It says, when you make this decision, what artifacts did you use? So artifacts are anything which is made by humans, spreadsheets, tools, processes. Yeah? I mean, it's a type of actant if you want to look at it that way. It's something which actually anybody can be picked up and trained to use. You then get skills. Sorry, get around on this. So skills are something where I know how to train you and I know how to measure whether you've got the skill. The example I normally use is plastering a wall. I mean, I've only ever done that once in my life. I've replumbed several houses. I've rebuilt all the furniture on a house I built in the main, all right? But only once have I tried to plaster a wall, because it's a high skill base and you just can't do it unless you've been properly trained. Yeah, but I know what it is to train somebody to plaster a wall, and I know how to measure whether they've got the skill or not. So these are more explicit. You then move on to habits. Now, habits are really important in human systems. Remember I talked yesterday about experienced drivers and naive drivers? What experienced drivers have got is the habit of driving, and that takes 2 or 3 years to acquire. Yeah, there's a whole body of stuff. We were talking yesterday about walking in the desert as opposed to walking on the rocky desert. And I know there's a way of walking on the desert which you guys can probably do, which would take me a long time to acquire. Yeah, habits are energy efficient, but they take time to acquire. And after habits, we get experience. Remember I talked yesterday about walking and my scanning the hillside continuously? That comes with walking now in those hills for 65 years. Yeah, I know those hills, I know the pattern of those hills, I know when, I just know things, but I only know them when I need to know them. And some of the experience you just can't have without that in terms of the way it works. And finally, we get natural talent. Some people are simply better at doing things than other people.